All right, let's cut the fluff. There's always been something deeply fascinating, and just a little unsettling, about the lone wolves of society. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Those individuals who wander through life on the outskirts, stepping to their own beat, completely detached from the rhythm of everyone else. They seem to glide effortlessly between moments of brilliance and borderline insanity. But what's actually going on behind their eyes? Is it genius, madness, or some twisted cocktail of both? Let's not pretend this is just some harmless curiosity. No, it's personal. If you're here, you've felt the pull of isolation, the intoxicating solitude that both terrifies and comforts you. Maybe you've been called eccentric, weird, or my personal favorite, intense. That's society's polite way of saying, we don't know what the hell to do with you. Well, welcome home. First things first, forget the romanticized bullshit about lone wolves. This isn't some Hollywood movie where a misunderstood hero rides off into the sunset. No, real lone wolves often ride straight into darkness, accompanied only by their overactive minds and a healthy dose of existential dread. Think of Friedrich Nietzsche wandering the streets of Turin, arguing with horses, or Vincent van Gogh painting starry nights while spiraling deeper into his personal abyss. These weren't happy endings, folks, but they were brutally honest explorations of what happens when you stray too far from the herd. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Lone wolves aren't necessarily born different. They're made. Usually shaped by disappointment, betrayal, or a deep primal instinct that something in society is fundamentally off. If you're nodding right now, congrats. You're probably more wolf than sheep. This video isn't here to stroke your ego, though. I'm not here to tell you you're special or destined for greatness. I'm here to confront you with the raw, complicated reality of your own psyche. Because isolation, while it might breed creativity, also breeds monsters. Loneliness can sharpen your insights, but it can also distort them beyond recognition. So let's journey deep into the labyrinth of your mind. We'll explore the crossroads where genius meets madness. We'll confront the darkness that comes with self-awareness. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come out the other side understanding ourselves a little better, or perhaps questioning even more. Because here's a secret. Sanity is overrated. It's safe, sure, comfortable even, but the price of admission is conformity, stagnation, and boredom. And if you're a lone wolf, boredom is worse than death. Let's get started. Let's rewind the tape. Lone wolves aren't plucked from thin air. They're carefully sculpted by circumstances that push them outside the pack. Think back to your own childhood. Maybe you were the kid who sat alone, not because you couldn't make friends, but because you didn't resonate with superficial chatter about the latest cartoons or playground gossip. You were busy thinking about things far beyond your years. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The lone wolf's journey often begins with this deep-seated sense of not belonging. Early experiences of rejection, bullying, or just plain misunderstanding become foundational, embedding a profound mistrust of others deep within your psyche. Soon enough, you figure out it's easier, safer, and frankly more peaceful to walk alone. And let's be brutally honest here. Early isolation isn't just a quiet sadness, it's formative trauma. It shapes the way you interact with the world. You develop razor-sharp intuition, a heightened sensitivity to social cues, and a fiercely independent streak. You become adept at reading people because you had to learn quickly who was safe and who wasn't. But this kind of forced maturity comes at a cost. It steals away your innocence and replaces it with a relentless internal dialogue. You begin to question everything. People's intentions, societal norms, even your own sanity. Trust, forget about it. Vulnerability, not in this lifetime. The consequence? You evolve into someone who values authenticity above all else, even if it means alienation. You'd rather be honest and alone than surrounded by superficial smiles and empty conversations. Yet this honesty is exactly what makes you magnetic to certain people. those who secretly crave depth but are too afraid to seek it themselves. Here's the kicker. The very traits that push you away from others are often your greatest strengths. Your intense introspection leads to unique insights, unconventional ideas, and original thinking. It's no coincidence that many lone wolves become influential artists, writers, philosophers, and innovators. Solitude is their crucible, transforming pain and isolation into something valuable. But remember, genius and madness share a blurred boundary. Just as solitude fosters creativity, prolonged isolation can erode your grip on reality. It's a delicate dance, a precarious balance, and not everyone makes it out intact. So, the question remains, how far can you wander before you get lost? Let's keep going. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, loneliness. The lone wolf's existence is a paradox, fiercely independent yet profoundly lonely. You love your freedom, but you also ache for meaningful connection. Here's the brutal reality. You can't have total freedom and deep intimacy at the same time. Not fully, not without compromise. Every lone wolf secretly dreams of finding another like-minded soul, someone who understands the chaos in their mind, someone who sees them without judgment. But here's the cruel twist. Lone wolves struggle to trust even when they find this person. Independence has become both your greatest asset and your biggest obstacle. You crave connection, yet fear dependency. You're terrified of losing your autonomy, of diluting your intensity just to fit into someone else's world. Here's the raw truth. Independence becomes an addiction. It's intoxicating. This feeling of being accountable to no one, of living by your own code, free from the judgments or expectations of others. But independence, when pursued relentlessly, evolves into isolation, and isolation eventually morphs into something much darker, emotional starvation. You see, independence isn't just freedom, it's armor. It shields you from pain, betrayal, and disappointment. Yet in its fierce protection, it denies you the basic human needs of vulnerability and connection. Sooner or later, your fortress of solitude turns into a prison, and what began as empowering self-sufficiency starts to suffocate you. Why does this happen? Because human beings are fundamentally social creatures, wired for connection. Even you, lone wolf, are not exempt from biology. No matter how strongly your mind resists, your heart secretly longs for acceptance, understanding, and emotional intimacy. But to admit this desire feels like weakness, like surrendering your precious autonomy. And here's where the dilemma crystallizes. Vulnerability terrifies you because it feels like handing someone else power over your emotional state. Your greatest fear isn't necessarily rejection, it's losing yourself to another person. You dread becoming emotionally dependent, as if dependency would erase the fiercely unique individual you've fought so hard to become. So you hold back, even when meaningful connection presents itself. You observe from a distance, analyzing, overthinking, trapped by your own hyper-awareness. People often mistake this for coldness or arrogance. They don't realize your distance is actually cautious curiosity, rooted in a fear of losing yourself. But here's a disturbing reality check. Total independence is an illusion. No one can live completely detached without eventually feeling hollow, numb, and disconnected. Not just from others, but from themselves. Your pursuit of absolute freedom paradoxically chains you to loneliness. Your isolation becomes a silent, invisible enemy, slowly eroding your sense of self-worth. Eventually, even your creative insights, the very thing you treasure, begin to suffer. Isolation, once the fuel for your ideas, now drains your inspiration. Your inner dialogue, always intense, becomes harsher and more critical. The clarity you once enjoyed starts twisting into confusion, doubt, and nihilistic despair. Yet, despite this suffering, admitting you need others feels unbearably shameful. The lone wolf's pride is both your greatest ally and most stubborn foe. Pride whispers, "I don't need anyone," even as your heart quietly asks, "But what if I do?" There's a cost to independence that no one talks about, a silent price paid in loneliness, misunderstood interactions, and missed opportunities for deep, meaningful relationships. And here's perhaps the cruelest twist of all. The more you understand yourself, the harder connecting with others becomes. You're trapped in a self-constructed paradox where your heightened self-awareness isolates you further from those who can't or won't see beneath the surface. But let's not wallow. This is not a pity party. It's an acknowledgement of reality. The cost of independence is high, but recognizing that cost is the first step toward reclaiming your emotional equilibrium. So ask yourself, lone wolf, how much isolation can you truly endure before independence becomes a prison sentence? And more importantly, how do you balance the freedom you cherish with the connection your soul craves? If this is hitting somewhere deep, I want to hear from you. Not for engagement, for realness. Tell me, has solitude shaped you? Has independence protected you or cost you something you can't name? Drop it in the comments. Speak like no one's watching. I read them all. And if someone else's comment feels like your own mind, let them know. Lone wolves don't always howl, but sometimes they recognize each other in silence. Let's continue deeper. This is where the story turns inward and gets uncomfortable. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Not many people are willing to peel back the layers. Most turn away the moment the mask begins to slip. But you're still here. That tells me you're ready to face what lies beneath your carefully constructed identity, ready to stare into the mirror without flinching. Let's start with the truth. Everyone has a shadow. Carl Jung wasn't being poetic when he coined the term. He was naming a psychological reality, the darker half of your psyche that you'd rather keep hidden. Your envy, your rage, your need for control, your shame, your lust, your fear of failure, they all live in the shadow, and for lone wolves, that shadow often grows unchecked. Why? Because isolation gives it room to fester. There's no one around to reflect your blind spots back to you, no relationships to temper your extremes, so the shadow grows powerful, seductive. It whispers lies that feel like truth. You're better than them. You don't need anyone. They'll just betray you. Over time, these whispers become internal commandments, shaping your behavior, your worldview, your identity. You start seeing the world not as it is, but through the distorted lens of your shadow. And the worst part? You think you're being objective. But let me be clear. Facing the shadow is not about self-hate or moral judgment. It's about radical honesty. It's about reclaiming parts of yourself you've buried, denied, or rejected. Because the longer you ignore your shadow, the more control it has over you. And eventually, it starts making decisions for you, from the shadows. It sabotages potential relationships. It fuels your cynicism. It whispers the kind of poisonous thoughts that keep you paralyzed. Why try? You'll just fail. They don't actually like you. You're not good enough. And because these thoughts sound like your own voice, you believe them. The path to integration begins when you stop resisting these parts of yourself. You don't have to act on them. You don't have to indulge them. But you do have to acknowledge them, own them, dialogue with them. Because once you do, something strange happens. They lose their grip. They stop being monsters in the basement and start becoming tools in your arsenal. That rage, it can become courage. That envy, it can point you toward your deepest desires. That fear, it can sharpen your focus. When you own your shadow, you stop being ruled by it, and you start becoming whole. But this isn't a one-time battle. It's a lifelong confrontation. The shadow doesn't disappear. It evolves. It hides in new places. It wears different masks. But every time you face it, you reclaim a piece of yourself that was lost to shame, repression, or fear. And here's the hard truth that no one tells you. The deeper your self-awareness, the darker the shadow you have to confront. That's the price of inner depth. It's not all insight and enlightenment. It's also reckoning, chaos, and breakdowns. But those breakdowns, they often precede breakthroughs. So if you're standing at the edge of your inner abyss, staring down the worst parts of yourself, good. That means you're getting close. Not to perfection, but to authenticity. Because the real lone wolf isn't the one who hides in the forest avoiding everyone. It's the one who enters the forest of their own mind and confronts the monsters within. Now we get to the part everyone romanticizes. The lone wolf's creative power, the genius, the vision, the raw originality that seems to pour out from the margins of society, from minds too strange, too intense, too untamable for the mainstream. And let's be honest, there's truth to it. Isolation gives birth to insight. Solitude sharpens perception. When you're removed from the herd, you stop mimicking the noise of the crowd, and you start hearing your own signal. This is the source of the lone wolf's genius: unfiltered thought, deep reflection, and an uncompromising vision forged in silence. Think of the greatest minds in history: Kafka, Tesla, Emily Dickinson, David Foster Wallace, Nietzsche. Their brilliance wasn't born in boardrooms or brainstorming sessions. It was shaped in isolation, in the crucible of their own internal chaos. That's the gift of solitude. It gives you uninterrupted access to the raw data of your own mind. You notice patterns others overlook. You question what others accept. You imagine what others fear to speak. You're not content with surface-level explanations. You drill deeper into the essence of things. And in doing so, you create ideas, art, philosophy, innovation that doesn't just echo culture, it challenges it. But here's the part they don't tell you in those Instagram quote posts about being a misunderstood genius. That same isolation that breeds originality also breeds distortion. Without external feedback, your thoughts become echo chambers. Without challenge, your ideas risk turning into delusions. Creativity without contact can start to lose grip with reality. It's a knife's edge. One moment you're channeling pure brilliance, the next you're spiraling into obsessive loops. You write for hours but forget to eat. You build a masterpiece that no one ever sees. You have profound insights that go unspoken because there's no one around to receive them. And then comes the existential crisis. What's the point of creating if no one understands it? That question haunts the lone wolf, because creativity, at its core, is communication, a desire to share something deeply personal with the world. But when the world feels like it doesn't care, or worse, can't understand, you start questioning your own purpose. So what do you do with the gift? You protect it, you nurture it, you give it the solitude it needs to thrive, yes, but you also tether it to reality. You test your ideas. You find even just one person to reflect them back to you. You resist the urge to vanish completely, because if your vision matters, and it does, then part of your responsibility is to give it a path into the world. And let's not ignore this. Your gift comes with suffering. Creativity is not just joy, it's pain, sacrifice, restlessness. It wakes you up at 3 a.m. with ideas you can't ignore. It isolates you, even from people who love you. It makes you weird, and sometimes it makes you hard to love. But it also makes you powerful, and the world needs that power, desperately. So don't run from it, don't silence it, don't water it down to fit in. Own the double-edged nature of your creativity. Let your solitude be the forge, not the grave. The lone wolf isn't just a hermit, it's a visionary, a creator, a conduit for the unspeakable. And when you learn to wield your gift without letting it consume you, you stop being a victim of your isolation and start becoming a master of it. Let's keep going. Here's something nobody tells you when you begin the journey of deep awareness. Clarity has a cost. The more you begin to truly see, the harder it becomes to look away. Once you've peeled back the layers of illusion, you can't unsee what's underneath. And often what's underneath is chaos, contradiction, and raw truth. The lone wolf doesn't just walk alone, they see alone. You see through the social games, you see the lies people tell to keep themselves comfortable. You recognize the masks. Hell, you probably wore them too once until they started to choke you. But now, with your sharpened perception, the world feels like it's made of cardboard cutouts and empty scripts. You see the performance in everyday life. The co-worker faking a smile, the influencer projecting happiness while breaking inside, the parent trying to control their child to avoid confronting their own failures. And worst of all, you see your own performances. The moments you betray your truth just to be palatable. The times you edit your soul so you can be liked. At first, this awareness feels like a superpower. You feel ahead of the curve, awake. You walk through life like you've cracked some kind of invisible code. But slowly, that power becomes a burden, because the more illusions you dissolve, the more alienated you feel. You start realizing how much of life is built on collective denial. Everyone nods and plays along. But you're not playing anymore. You've stepped off the stage, and now you're watching the play from the outside. And it's not just them you see differently. It's everything. Systems, institutions, norms, culture. You notice how most people chase things they don't even want. How they define success by standards they never chose. How suffering is often disguised as ambition, and numbness is sold as peace. This is what I mean by the price of vision. Because vision isn't just about insight, it's about isolation. It's about realizing that the more clearly you see, the less clearly you are seen. People don't understand you. They might admire your mind, even quote your words, but they don't truly grasp the internal reality you navigate daily. And that misunderstanding, it cuts deep. You're not trying to be different. You're not trying to be above anyone. You just are different. Your mind works in layers. Your emotions come in waves. Your truth feels too heavy for casual conversation. So you either carry it alone or you dilute it. Neither option feels good. Sometimes you'll wish you could go back to ignorance, back to being easily amused, back to believing in things just because everyone else did. But once the veil lifts, it doesn't come back down. You may even ask yourself, was it worth it? Was awakening really better than sleep? Because sleep was easier. Sleep had friends. Sleep had comfort. Sleep had simplicity. But let's be honest, you were never meant for sleep. The truth? Vision is painful, but it's pure. It breaks you, but it also builds you into something real. It strips away the false, and what's left is you, unfiltered, uncomfortable, but undeniably authentic. And here's the twist. Vision, when fully embraced, doesn't just isolate, it guides. The very clarity that once made you feel cursed becomes your compass. It helps you recognize the real ones. It draws you toward authenticity, even if it's rare. It pushes you to create, not just to express yourself, but to offer others a glimpse of what you've seen. Because maybe, just maybe, your vision isn't just for you. Maybe you're not here to be understood by everyone. Maybe you're here to remind others of what they've forgotten, to reflect the truths they've buried, to wake people up, not by preaching, but by being. The price of vision is steep. But what it gives you in return? It gives you freedom, not comfort, not ease, but liberation. From illusion, from conformity, from needing to belong to places that could never hold the real you. So if you're seeing too much, feeling too much, knowing too much, don't collapse under it, stand inside it, let it burn off everything false, and then speak, create, live, not to be understood, but to be true. Let's go further. Here's the paradox every lone wolf eventually runs into. You escaped the herd to find freedom. But now the real battle isn't out there. It's in here, inside your own mind, inside the fortress you built to survive. And sometimes, It's a war zone. You thought the challenge was solitude. But solitude is easy compared to the war of self-sabotage, the quiet but constant civil war between the person you are and the one you're afraid to become. That voice in your head, the one that doubts, criticizes, mocks your ambitions. That's your shadow in uniform, disguised as discipline. It wears your face, it uses your voice, and it knows every weak spot you have. The lone wolf doesn't need enemies. The lone wolf is the enemy. You second-guess your instincts. You overanalyze your actions. You start projects and abandon them. You get close to someone, then ghost them out of fear. You plan the future in great detail, then convince yourself it's pointless the next morning. Why? Because no one ever taught you how to trust yourself, not fully. You've spent so much time dodging other people's expectations that now you struggle to differentiate between self-guidance and self-sabotage. Every decision becomes a debate. Every moment of peace feels suspicious. You're constantly scanning for some unseen threat. But here's the brutal truth. No one's holding you back anymore. There's no teacher to rebel against, no boss to blame, no friend to disappoint. There's just you, and your fear of what would happen if you actually lived without apology. Because that's the terrifying part, isn't it? If you stopped doubting, stopped hesitating, if you fully stepped into your potential, you'd have to own the consequences. No more excuses, no more hiding behind perfectionism or overthinking, just raw, exposed action. And if it failed, that failure would be yours, entirely. That's the inner war, the part of you that longs to be seen battling the part of you that would rather disappear than risk rejection. The artist versus the critic, the dreamer versus the doubter, the child who wants to play versus the adult who says, grow up. So how do you fight a war within? You don't. Not forever. You negotiate. You listen. You stop treating parts of yourself like enemies. You stop trying to kill off the voices you don't like and start understanding where they came from. The doubt, it was born from early failure, the inner critic. That's your guardian trying to protect you from pain. The perfectionist, a traumatized optimist who still thinks the only way to be loved is to be flawless. You don't defeat these voices. You lead them. And leadership starts with listening. Ask, what are you afraid of? What are you protecting me from? What would happen if I didn't listen to you for once? Eventually, the battlefield becomes a council room. The internal screaming quiets. The resistance turns into conversation. And that's when real clarity emerges. Not the kind that's born from isolation or intellect, the kind that's born from integration, from unity, from realizing that every part of you, yes, even the messy ones, deserve a seat at the table. Because the real power of the lone wolf isn't just in walking alone. It's in learning how to walk with all the versions of yourself and still move forward. The war within doesn't end with victory. It ends with peace. Let's move on. So the illusions have collapsed. The roles, the scripts, the systems. You've seen through them all. You're no longer seduced by shallow praise, empty ambition, or synthetic success. You've burned through the lies. And what's left? Silence, space, void. This is the part they don't prepare you for. The vacuum left behind once you stop playing by society's rules. No more identity props. No more performance metrics. No more pretending you care about things you don't. It should feel liberating, but it feels terrifying. Because when the noise is gone, all you're left with is the question, now what? This is where the existential desert begins. It's dry, it's vast, it's honest. And it doesn't give you easy answers. It demands that you create your own. Because in this new reality, meaning isn't found, it's forged. Most people never get here. They stay in the loop of social validation, spiritual bypassing, or endless productivity. But you've stepped off the map. You're in the unknown, and the unknown has a brutal kind of beauty. There are no distractions here, just you, your breath, and your brutal awareness that life doesn't come preloaded with purpose. That you, for all your intellect and insight, must now become the architect of your own meaning. And that's the great irony. You thought awakening would give you peace. Instead, it gave you responsibility. You are now both the seeker and the source. But don't let the silence scare you. This space you're in, it's sacred. It's the birthplace of authenticity, the forge of the true self. When everything superficial is stripped away, you finally have the raw material to build something real. Not just a lifestyle, but a life. Not just goals, but a direction. So what gives life meaning? That's not a question I can answer for you. No one can. But here's what I can offer. Meaning doesn't have to be grand. It just has to be real. It often hides in the mundane, in stillness, in service, in struggle. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It's sculpted, slowly, through daily intention. Maybe meaning for you is creating something that outlives you. Maybe it's healing what hurt you. Maybe it's helping one other person make sense of their chaos. Whatever it is, you won't find it on a vision board or in a guru's lecture. You'll find it in the quiet moments, when you stop searching for answers and start listening to the questions. Because the truth is, the question is the path. You're not broken for feeling lost. You're awake. You're not empty. You're in transition. You're not meaningless. You're in the process of choosing what matters. And when you finally begin to fill that void, not with distractions, but with purpose, you'll realize that the existential desert wasn't a punishment. It was an invitation. Let's keep going. Redemption doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it sneaks in quietly, through a breath, a breakdown, a moment of stillness that somehow doesn't shatter you. And that's how it begins, not with applause or validation, but with the gentle realization that you've survived yourself. This part of the journey isn't loud, it's not cinematic, it's subtle, even invisible to the outside world. But for you, it's everything. You spent years trying to belong, then years running from the idea entirely. You rejected systems, communities, expectations. You wore your alienation like armor. You convinced yourself that isolation was purity, that connection was compromise. And maybe for a while it was. But now, something new is stirring. A quiet rebellion, not against society, but against your own extremes. You begin to see that rejecting the world is not the same as transcending it, that disappearing isn't the same as becoming. This is redemption, not in the religious sense, not in the moral sense, but in the existential sense, the redemption of yourself to yourself. A sacred reintroduction, a homecoming. You're not trying to fit in anymore, but you're also not trying to fight everything. You've stopped defining yourself by what you're not. And for the first time you ask, who am I without the resistance? And the answer doesn't roar, it whispers. You're becoming, slowly, painfully, honestly. Not some idealized version of yourself, not the polished mask you used to wear in hopes of acceptance, but the raw, evolving, paradoxical truth of who you are. You laugh more, even at the absurdity of your own mind. You soften, not because you're weak, but because you've finally seen that strength without softness is just armor, and armor gets heavy. You find moments of connection that feel real, even if fleeting. You realize you don't have to be understood by many, just seen by a few. And maybe most importantly, you stop seeing your past as a curse. You begin to see it as material, as compost, as everything you needed to break in order to build. That loneliness, it taught you discernment. That rage, it gave you fire. That despair, it cracked you open so something real could grow. You start forgiving yourself, not in some performative, spiritual bypass kind of way, but truly. You look back and see that every version of you was trying, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones. And in that forgiveness, there's space. Space to be, not to prove, not to perform, just to exist. You don't belong. Not to systems, not to expectations, not even to an identity. But you're becoming something deeper, something fluid, something true. And that, lone wolf, is your quiet redemption. It doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. It doesn't need to be shared to be sacred. You've walked through the fire. You've spoken with your shadows. You've danced with madness and made art from pain. And now here you are, still walking, still breathing, still becoming, not belonging but becoming. Let's bring it home. If you've made it this far, this isn't just a video anymore. It's a mirror. And you didn't stumble into this by accident. You came here for a reason, even if you can't name it yet. Maybe you're in the thick of it. Maybe you're somewhere between breakdown and breakthrough. Maybe you've burned every bridge. Or maybe you're standing on the last one, debating whether to cross or set it on fire. Wherever you are, this is for you. You're not crazy. You're not broken. You're not too much. You're just awake in a world that profits off sleep. You've wandered the labyrinth of your mind, traced every corridor of pain, of doubt, of shadow, and now you're at the threshold. No, this isn't the end, but it is the turning point, the place where survival transforms into creation, where isolation becomes intention. You don't have to disappear to be real. You don't have to suffer to be deep. You don't have to reject everything to stay true to yourself. The lone wolf path doesn't mean walking forever in exile. It means learning how to walk through the world without losing your soul. Maybe you never find a tribe. Maybe you never fully fit in. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is to be a lighthouse in a fogged-up world. Not because you have all the answers, but because you've lived through the questions. Maybe the point is to become someone you can trust, someone your younger self needed, someone who isn't trying to be understood, but to be whole. You've seen too much to go back. But that means you've also seen enough to go forward, with clarity, with courage, with something rare in today's world: integrity. So if you're still here, still breathing, still becoming, walk on, not as a ghost, not as a martyr, but as a conscious, wild, unshakable version of yourself. You may never escape the labyrinth entirely, but you can learn to navigate it. You can leave breadcrumbs. You can light torches. You can reach out, not to be saved, but to remind someone else they're not alone in here. You're not the only one. You never were. But you might be the first to go this far, this deep, and come back with something real, not a map, a message. This was it. Now go live it.